Okay, good day to everyone. So just a quick note, my topic did change slightly since my abstract submission, so just to let everyone know. So the previous speakers have already spoken about what microplastics are, the different types and where they come from, so I'm just going to jump into how they relate to my study. So my study basically incorporated two different aspects, an environmental analysis and a laboratory experiment. And just to keep in mind as well that the previous speaker and myself did sample the sediment and water samples together, so you might see a few overlaps there. So my study area was based at Inyoni Rocks, which is a popular fishing and recreational area in Amanzimtoti. And studies on microplastic distribution in this area are quite limiting, and this can be quite worrisome in light of the large number of filter-feeding bivalves present there. In particular, your Saccostrea cuccullata, which will then be at risk of microplastic exposure due to its filter-feeding abilities. Now, oysters are vital ecosystem engineers, and they also provide a source of food for many organisms, including humans. So, plastics in the area can therefore pose a threat to these oyster populations as well as to human health. In light of this, the aims of my study were firstly to identify the microplastic pollution levels within the sediment and water samples at Inyoni. Then for the laboratory experiment, I first wanted to determine if cuccullata, which is the local bivalve species there, if they were able to ingest the microplastic fibers. And if they were, then to determine the effect of different microplastic concentrations on their filtering abilities. So sediment samples were obtained from the high, mid, and low tide zones, and then these were separated out from the sediment through a density separation method, and then obviously viewed and counted under a microscope. Water samples were also filtered through varying mesh sizes and then analyzed in a similar manner. In the filtration experiment, your fluorescent microplastic fibers were added to your tank containing the oysters, which were allowed then to filter for a 1 hour period. Water samples were then taken, the fibers counted, and then filtration rates determined. So the results basically depicted that your microplastic concentrations were greatest within the sediment samples compared to the water samples. But when compared to other coastal areas such as your Durban Harbour, Richards Bay, and the South Coast, Inyoni had relatively low concentrations. And these are some of the plastics that we found: the polystyrene particles, these blue sort of fragments, clumps of fibers, and then individual fibers of varying lengths and colors. So fibers were also deemed most predominant at Inyoni Rocks, with all of the tidal fibers contained all of the tidal zones contained your fibers. Thank you. And 70% of the water samples contained fibers within the size ranges of 80 to 500 micrometers. In the uptake preliminary experiment, your microplastic fibers were successfully ingested by all 10 of your oyster specimens, with an average of about 10 particles per organism. In the filtration experiment, your filtration rates initially increased with microplastic exposure levels of 1 milligram per litre to 2 milligram per litre. However, when they were exposed to 5 milligrams per litre, their filtration rates completely dropped and were halted. So this could pretty much be due to the false satiation effect or even the impairment of their filtering abilities. So what does this mean? Well, microplastic concentrations, then we can see, are relatively low at Inyoni Rocks in comparison to other areas. Therefore, the current microplastic levels don't really pose a threat to the species' filtering abilities currently. However, future microplastic increases can definitely result in detrimental effects to their functioning. Additionally, the species was capable of ingesting these microplastic fibers, then creating a passageway for the transfer of these microplastics from the environment. Thank you.